Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers of Washington in its monthly author showcase. I am your host, Mark Miller. Author Thomas Mengert is visiting with us this month at the Bremerton Kitsap Access Television Studios. Tom was interviewed by Claw before. Since the last interview, he has embarked on some other interesting and fruitful literary projects. Thomas, once again, welcome to Claw.
Thank you. Good to see you, Mike.
Yeah. Now to start with, in the last interview, you were discussing a fiction series, The Confessions of Sherlock Holmes. Now you have a series of non-fiction works to discuss. I'd like you to describe those works as well as answer the question, what's it like to switch from fiction to nonfiction and why?
Well, the purpose behind what every writer does is to write about what they know about. And what I wanted to emphasize today when I came here was the idea that for micro publishers, we have a chance now to hear from people that we may never have heard from before. In the old days, the way publishing worked was that it was a family operation. Most publishing houses were owned by families like Scribner's and Sons that published our three greatest writers, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and Thomas Wolfe. And it was a different kind of a sense of how a writer could get their word out and interface with the public. And the editor played a huge role. For instance, Max Perkins was the editor of all three of these great writers that I've mentioned. What happened was sometime in the 1960s, publishing became seen much more as just a business. The value of the imprint was much less distinctive. And so what happened is a lot of publishing companies were bought up by larger organizations, conglomerates. And now, not only was the reader divorced from the writer by a publishing house, but now even the publishing house was seen as just part of the portfolio of a larger entity. So somewhere along the line, the intimacy of writer and reader broke down. So what happened, fortunately, is that writers began to realize that what was going on was that they were being divorced by things that were beyond their capacity to control from access to the reader, and the reader simultaneously was going through a frustrating experience that the full gamut of available works was not available to them. True, you could find it up on large things like Amazon, but you couldn't find it in the sense that it was had before, where people would literally wait to say, what's on Scribner's list this fall? What new books are coming out? Unless you went to a book show, in which case this is still there. But even the idea that certain publishers were famous for certain types of works began to break down, because as the market fragmented, what happened was they began to realize that they'd had to hit niche markets, and so they broke up their publishing imprint into minor areas. And so what happened is that this intimacy that we'd always had began to break down, and then we started watching bookstores get conglomerated up and gobbled up. And so that further intimacy of what does your particular bookseller have to recommend? What's exciting on the shelves today? Fortunately, as micro-publishing began to take over, and writers began to say, I don't need a publisher. I can create the same quality of actual presentation. I can create a wonderful looking book, and I can do all this and directly appeal to my audience through social media and through book signings and things like this. It actually became closer than it had ever been before. Because in the old days, you only had a certain amount of time to sell your books, because the rest of the time they were in some dusty warehouse, where now printing was on demand.
And so when you're talking about micro-publishers, you're also talking about not only self-publishers, but then some of the smaller presses that have grown up locally.
Exactly. So now we come to your question, which I had to have this little preliminary to get to, which was that even my fictional work was designed to answer certain fundamental questions. It was the particular avenue I took as a writer. I realized that the Sherlock Holmes imprint was probably the most widely known. Everyone says that Sherlock Holmes is the most widely known fictional character of all time. And so I wanted to write a book that was a philosophy book that was overlaid with a fictional design where Holmes and Watson would solve the great problems of what's life and death. And this is partially my own background in philosophy, and the books that I enjoyed when I was getting my master's degree in English literature were books like Joyce's Ulysses and his wonderful masterpiece Finnegan's Wake.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, well, if I'm going to write, I don't want to write like everybody else. I would like to write in a way that takes whatever I think is most important, because you as a writer know this also, that it takes a lot of time to write any book. It's a commitment of time and aloneness where you don't have a cheerleading squad to help you through those long, lonely hours. And if the ideas and the words aren't there, you can't necessarily dredge them out. If they're not demanding to be heard, it's very hard to write a book. Many times young authors say, well, I'd like to write, but I don't know what to write about. And the problem with that is if you don't feel this upwelling within you to get out the purpose of what you're talking about, it's pretty hard to say, well, what are you interested in? What do you feel passionate about? That's probably the best thing that you could say to them. So what happened with me is when I finished the 7 volumes, which are the Confessions of Sherlock Holmes, its collective title,
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, there's some other things now that I want to write about that I think are very serious and that will allow me to step out of the Sherlock Holmes mode for a while. And so I began to move on to other topics.
So specifically then, what attracted you into one of your books, of course, is a subject of borderline personality in your book, Negotiating with the Borderline, a lawyer's look at borderline personality disorder.
Yes.
That seems to be a very eclectic subject for a lawyerly scholarship.
Well, what happens is that most of the books on borderline personality disorder have obviously been written by psychologists. I did a little research, and I am not aware of any attorney who's written a book. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to take the skills and the way of looking at the world that is present for an attorney and apply that to what is considered one of the most difficult to understand and empathize with psychological conditions, which is borderline personality disorder. For those of your viewers who may not be familiar with this diagnosis, personality disorders are not what we normally think of as mental illnesses. We think mental illness, we think schizophrenia,
Mm-hmm.
we think manic depression, we think various neurotic conditions, but we don't think about what's a personality disorder. And on its face, it seems something a little bit contradictory there. How can you say that any personality, the most intimate part of yourself, is disordered? Who's to be the judge of that?
Well, even the AMA changes its definitions.
Yes, well, the DSM, the recent, what you see with any borderline personality or any other type of personality disorder is a set of characteristics that represent what you might call a life stance, a way of dealing with the world. And people who manifest borderline personality disorder tend to have a thing called splitting, which is they go back and forth between idealizing significant others in their life and going to the exact polar opposite and seeing them in entirely different lights. And it's very hard for them to get what's called object constancy. Well, what I wanted to do as an attorney was not to replicate what psychologists have done before me and have done in a way that I couldn't do as an attorney, but I wanted to take this idea of negotiating, and which is what lawyers do all the time, towards win-win situations. And I wanted to say, isn't it possible that if we see borderline personality disorder as a non-productive life stance, basically you're offering the world a contract that just doesn't work because the terms are changeable. The mere fact of inability to maintain object constancy makes it very hard for them to engage in intimate relationships. And I said, maybe it would be possible to shorten the term of the contract to as little as a week or a month, and to be very clear about your terms, and then, if necessary, modify the contract, what attorneys call a novation, where you make a new contract. But you try to negotiate, and to do that, you have to understand that the borderline's emotions are very real for them. They're not faking it. This is really how they experience the world.
And of course, not only from the idea of using negotiation from a lawyer aspect, you literally, if you're having some type of personality disorder in the way you deal in society, you can actually have legal problems because of that.
Well, that is true also, and I tried to and I have a very clear disclaimer that I'm not claiming to be a psychologist, and the book is not meant to be a therapy book. What it is meant to be is a book addressed hopefully to professionals, but to anybody that wants to enter into understanding what the borderline experiences is from the inside. So hopefully that this would give a sense of empathy for the anxiety, the fears, and the pain that people who suffer from this condition go through.
So if somebody has a family member, significant other or somebody, this would give them a different tool kind of to try to, in trying to understand what's going on.
It would give them what I call taking an oblique view of something. Like, let's say you have an object on the table and you always see it from this particular angle. If you can shift your focus and see it from an oblique angle, you're naturally going to see things that you didn't notice before. And simply the way lawyers look at things is a little different than the way most people look at things. The law trains you to see things in certain categories, and so that led me into some of my next endeavors. After I finished the book on borderline personality disorder, I wanted to write a book about the creative process itself. What is it that we do when we write fiction? Which takes you, in a sense, back to your first question, which is what are writers trying to do? They're trying to connect with their ideal audience. And I said, I'd like to write about my favorite author was Thomas Wolfe when I came out of college. And Thomas Wolfe is not Tom Wolfe. They're different writers. Thomas Wolfe is the one who wrote Look Homeward Angel and Of Time and the River, The Web and the Rock, and he's an incredible writer of America's feelings. Well, he died at 38 years of age, and he died of tuberculosis of the brain. It was a reactivated, probably early affliction that he probably had tuberculosis in his youth.
You're right.
And so just before he took ill, he traveled across the western United States, and he always planned on writing a book about his experiences called Pacific End. So I said, why don't I take up where Thomas Wolfe left off? So I wrote a book called Pacific End, Notes for a Novel. The reason I call it Notes for a Novel is I wanted it to be about the novel writing process itself. What are we doing when we write fiction? And does fiction distort our view of the world? Right. Does it give us faulty expectations of what life's really about? Or does it bring us closer? And I said, what if I wrote a book about writing a book? And there's precedence for this. When Steinbeck was writing East of Eden, he kept a journal that was later published, his notes on the writing of East of Eden. And it was fascinating because it was consisted largely of letters that he wrote during that period. But I thought I was really onto something with this, because I said, every one of us is looking for what I call a Pacific End, which is how do we reach a sense for what our life has been about? Everybody sooner or later has to have a summation. Well, my summation was the Confessions of Sherlock Holmes, 7 volumes of that. But I said, I had to hide behind a fictional character to write those reflections that appear in the Confessions of Sherlock Holmes. Here, I can write it verbatim, just as it's happening.
But at the same time, of course, not being satisfied just with that, you decided to get even in another controversial subject. You also wrote a book, The 11th Hour, A Catholic Apologetics for the 21st Century.
That became my 11th book. And the reason that I chose the term the 11th hour was because I began to notice that in writing Pacific End, I had raised some significant theological questions. And I wanted to write a book that would look at Catholicism systematically, and yet not be such an unwieldy volume that I'd be replicating what you could get from a catechism. I wanted to approach it again like an attorney would. I wanted to approach it in a fashion that would say, how do you argue the case of Catholicism? And that's exactly what apologetics is. As a discipline, apologetics is a preliminary to what you would call catechetics. Catechetics is where you learn the details of the doctrines of any given faith. But apologetics opens up the door to say, is there grounds for even considering this an important question? What is it that would make someone want to consider Catholicism? So certainly I'm not a priest, and I'm not in the position to speak authoritatively from the church's position. But once again, I said, what if I had tried this in a very personal avenue? My personal apologetics for the Catholic faith.
But because you grew up in the church,
I did.
You also have that more personal connection with the theology, which enables you, in addition to being a lawyer, being able to look at the aspect of taking what you were taught as you grew up and then comparing it to, like you said, your experiences in the world.
Yes, well, what I really wanted to get at is I wanted to write a book for people that think that the questions of faith are outdated, that they're part of some prior age when people needed celestial answers for questions. So I really have always, I did this in the Sherlock Holmes series too, I wanted to raise every possible doubt that people could go through and then try to answer it. It's sort of like what an attorney actually wants. Law is most exciting when you have a very difficult case. It's not fun if it's a slam dunk.
Right.
You want resistance, and so I try to bring up one of the questions that I raise is the situation that one of my favorite philosophers, Soren Kierkegaard, addresses, which is perhaps the problem with faith is it becomes too easy. If we don't feel a personal connection, if it's not something that we feel as an absolute, like we're standing on the edge of a cliff, and our whole existence is predicated upon whether this is true or not true. And that's the kind of commitment that I wanted to get across in my writing. I wanted to raise questions that were, without being overly dramatic, life and death questions.
Well, of course, then, not satisfied just with that, Tom has to go off on something else. Then you decide you need to look at another serious subject in one of your books. So then you wrote, Dean Langdell is Dead, the breakdown of the American legal profession. First of all, you're going to have to, in just a second, explain who Dean Langdell was and what this story is about the legal profession. But before that, I'll have to admit that because of my background in law enforcement, I had to spend a lot of time in court. So I saw a lot of the interplay between in the legal system between all the various parts of the legal system.
Well, one of the things, first of all, to answer your question about who is Dean Langdell. Dean Langdell was the creator of the case study method that is still used in every American law school. And it's where you look at the actual raw material of appellate decisions. And you try to deduce common threads of the law by reading case after case after case after case. And it isn't that you can't learn law by having things that are like restatements or reading what law students call hornbooks, which are treatises on the law. But Dean Langdell was of the opinion that the world was like a laboratory, and lawyers would become far better adept at seeing fine gradations of meaning by actually going to the raw material of the law and seeing the great minds of the great judges wrestling with these concepts in different fact situations. So you say, then, why say Dean Langdell is dead? Well, first of all, it sounds like a mystery story. So I wanted it to, most people aren't going to pick up a great weighty tome, but I wanted something that said the world of Dean Langdell, where we could get an overview of the law and arrive at a science of the law by an empirical discipline of gathering as much stuff as we can together. I said, unfortunately, that era is dead. It's not coming back. But I didn't say that the legal system is breaking down. I said that in many ways the profession is breaking down. And the reason that the profession is breaking down is because of a new concept that puts the primary emphasis less on the client-lawyer relationship than it does on the idea that lawyers are purveyors of legal services.
Right.
That seems like a slight differentiation. But the old idea included such things as not having what we now call unbundled legal services, where you can essentially say, I'll handle this much of the problem that you're dealing with, but I have to cut it off there. It's sort of like, in my mind at least, it's like halfway fixing a car. It's saying, well, I'll take care of, you got a carburetor problem, but meanwhile your wheels are falling off. I think it's far more important to have a relationship. You see this in medicine too. You like to have what you call a primary medical service provider. You like to go to someone that sees your health over a long period of time so they can see holistically what your problems are and how you can attain health. Well, I think the older avenues of the legal profession had a much more dignified sense, and lawyers were the ones that kept that going. But by saying that things are breaking down, I also wanted to address the law itself. We have a tendency now to have so much law out there. The sheer volume of it is so great that you have parallel case lines. And the difference between which is applicable is almost like an onion skin. You don't have the same sense of respect for precedent that I think was present in the old days. The old thought was that you follow precedent. What has been decided before, we should decide the same way now. But what if you have multiple conflicting lines of precedent? How do you know what the law is?
Well, then part of that, and of course, we're going to bump into the next book you wrote, then gets involved with the whole political idea of that has unfortunately, I would say, affected the idea of what the law is. Now it's turned into, win-loss ratios and stuff like that, as opposed to the actual law.
Well, there's so much in the last book, because it was written over a longer period of time than the others. It actually bridged the last three books, and it's... So the Dean Langdell book is certainly one of my major works. The other thing, though, that I would say is that I'm perplexed by the age that we're living in right now. And so I wrote a little mini pamphlet called The Great Reset, which says that we need to reset our expectations. We began with a feeling after the final breakup of the Soviet Union that America stood alone, the world's great superpower, and Francis Fukuyama wrote a book about the end of history. And it's very, very apparent that we have not reached the end of history. In fact, what we are seeing instead is revisiting problems that we thought were settled. Resurgence in North Korea, we see a resurgence of Chinese nationalism, all kinds of things going on with Russia right now. But to start pulling some of this together, what you see in everything that I've written is my own attempt to try to write to what I think are megatrends of this particular time. And they're always to say, what can this particular writer say to this particular niche audience on this particular niche problem? I think sometimes we think that of bestsellers as being generic,
Right.
that if one book will simply appeal to everybody. But what you'd like to do is to do what I think your previous guest did so well, which is to write to an audience that's very interested in she was writing a book about her nautical experiences and traveling around the world in a sailboat. Well, you understand that if you are a sailor, but even if you've never been able to take such a journey, you're fascinated by it. And so this idea of the intimacy between the writer and the reader is really what's the thing that's holding independent publishing together, because you're hearing experiences and books that in the old days might never have seen print.
Right. And so with all these books you've written, how would somebody find your books? Are they available online?
They are. The Sherlock Holmes series, all 7 volumes, are available on Amazon.com in a Kindle format. Several of my books are available from KitsapPublishing.com, including the actual physical volumes of the Sherlock Holmes series. Also, the Borderline Personality Disorder book is available from that same source, and the other books I've done under the Victorian Gentleman's Press, which is it's a different imprint.
Right.
But once again, I think that information on them could be probably reached by going to Kitsap Publishing.
So I'd like to thank you again for coming here. This is your second time on the BCAT Claw Hot Seat. Your creative abilities will be an inspiration to many people. I would like to thank all of our viewers for tuning into Bremerton Kitsap Access Television and viewing this Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers production. I also wish to thank the BCAT staff on cameras and in the director's chair. Without their efforts, this would not happen. Our next broadcast is scheduled upcoming here in April, when another of the fascinating artists of Kitsap County will grace your TV screen. So keep in touch with your Facebook pages to see what Kitsap author we will be interviewing. I hope everyone has a pleasant day and a productive and fascinating year. Until next time, I am Mark Miller with Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers, in conjunction with Bremerton Kitsap Access Television. Good day.